Thanks so much, Gemma. I'm hoping everyone can hear me. Yeah, looks like everyone can hear me. As Gemma said, I'm Selena, and thank you so much for this opportunity to give you a very brief overview of this piece of research on strengthening a legal and policy environment to prevent violence against women and girls. I authored the first brief in this prevention series with my colleague Lisa LaRue, so it's really excited to have reached the final one. This synthesis review contributes to a discussion of the important roles which civil society organisations are playing in this systems level task of law and policy reform, their effective implementation, and access to justice for women and girls. This is a particularly challenging task, as civil society organisations are rarely central actors who control law or policy making, and as a result, there is much to learn from the diverse projects of the civil society organisations in this sample, funded by the UN Trust Fund. Next slide, please. So at the heart of this synthesis review are practitioner insights from 9 CSOs implementing violence against women and girls prevention programming. Engaging with the wider systems of law and/or government policy was, for all of these organisations, a key component of their UN Trust funded work across VAWG prevention, even if it might not always have been framed explicitly within a prevention lens. One of the overarching insights from this review is that connections between access to justice and prevention are cyclical rather than linear. All 9 CSOs also work in some way at other levels, with their systems level work often tethered to or emerging from their work with women and girls at other levels. The 9 CSOs that were selected carried out a range of activities in this space, not only focused on reforming or repealing laws and policies, but also ensuring that they are implemented effectively and seeking to support those who are most in need of their protection to actually access them in practice. So I learned so much from these 9 organisations, so please allow me to name all 9 grantees. The learning that we share today and in this brief is theirs, and you'll hear more from some of these organisations directly later in the panel. ActionAid from Myanmar, Regional Rights Resource Team from Solomon Islands, Pragya from India, Women's Centre for Legal Aid and Counselling from Palestine, Asamblea de Cooperación por la Paz from El Salvador, the Leonard Cheshire Disability Trust from Zimbabwe, Association Chega Baita from Timor-Leste, Rainbow Sky Association from Thailand, and Women Initiatives for Gender Justice, working cross-regionally across the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sudan, Libya, and Uganda. Next slide, please. So this conceptual framework was designed in the aftermath of the inductive research process, based on the practical learnings that had emerged about how and why civil society organisations engage to help strengthen this enabling environment for VAWG prevention. It's designed to be a tool to assist civil society organisations to think carefully about how and why to position themselves in their specific context in relation to the many different ways that civil society organisations are contributing to this central goal or hub. So as illustrated by the centre of this diagram, the aim of strengthening an enabling environment for prevention offers a broader and conceptual container for a range of civil society work around laws and policies that also keeps the focus on the preventative, proactive nature of these systems, and not only a reactive response after violence has taken place. Although this, of course, is also an integral part of these systems. It also helps to identify how and why CSOs are important within this systems level task. 4 areas emerge from the work being done by the specific sample, and while this is not an exhaustive list, it offers a guiding frame for the different places where an individual organisation may choose to position its work within their specific context. First, advocacy and evidence building for law and policy reforms. Second, building the capacity of formal legal and government institutions. Third, bridging gaps between laws and policy systems and informal systems at community level. And fourth, improving access to justice for VAWG survivors and mechanisms for holding perpetrators accountable. You'll see that in the diagram, these four areas are not positioned in a linear way. In fact, they form a cycle where effective access to justice and perpetrator accountability lead back into the need for improved laws and policies, something that emerged as particularly significant in transitional justice contexts. These four areas form the structure for the findings of the overall review, although it's important to remember that in reality, work between these areas is often overlapping. And while all four aspects of this cycle or wheel do need to be in place, the framework does not suggest that each individual civil society organisation must work across them all. Civil society organisations that were specific about where they put their focus were often more effective than those that just tried to do everything. So I'm now briefly going to just give you an overview of the findings that emerged in this brief. Next slide, please. First, advocating and evidence building for law and policy reforms. So strong laws and government policies for VAWG prevention that offer a comprehensive framework, harmonise civil and criminal laws, and are proactive and binding on policy actors and statutory duty bearers are essential. Civil society organisations were seen to be playing important roles in law and policy reform and at times also repeal. And these roles included advocacy and evidence building strategies that are driven by the community and led by the people. This was done, for example, by ACP in El Salvador, working alongside women's rights networks. Second, partnering for a shared advocacy agenda so that marginalised groups aren't left behind. We saw this with Leonard Cheshire in Zimbabwe, making sure that women and girls with disabilities were also protected by laws and policies. And third, centralising the voices and participation of women, both as system insiders, such as women parliamentarians, and as outsiders who lobby the system, such as women's rights groups and networks. For example, Pragya in India worked to empower rural women to participate as political figures at different levels and to use their power to tackle issues facing women. And we see this in the quote on the slide, which I'm not going to read. Next slide, please. So our second key finding was the need to build the capacity of judicial, law enforcement and government institutions. As Gemma noted, formal duty bearers, such as the police, judicial and government ministry personnel, need to be equipped to effectively implement new and existing laws and policies around VAWG prevention. Many of the grantees were playing incredibly important roles in bridging the gaps between policy and practice, not by developing a parallel system, but by working on the institutional capacity of these formal duty bearers. And this included, one, delivering a range of capacity development activities for these duty bearers. Two, shifting mindsets within these institutions to address VAWG in a less reactive and a more proactive and preventative way. And third, convening and catalysing positive collaborations and multi-sectoral partnerships. And these activities of convening, capacitating, and catalysing multi-sectoral engagement was a critical overall role we saw over so many of the CSOs, playing behind the scenes, influences who were not always fully acknowledged because the results take place within and between other institutions. But helping connect departments and different stakeholders together to work holistically rather than in silos was a critical role for some of the organisations, as the quote on the slide there shows. Next slide, please. Our third key finding was bridging gaps between formal laws and policies and informal systems at community level. We saw that informal and customary systems were often playing key roles in adjudicating legal and policy issues at community level and reinforcing gendered social norms, both positive and negative, in ways that often still shape the lives of women and girls in particular. So we saw civil society organisations playing important roles here, including by making these informal systems more women-centred and survivor-friendly, by helping to reshape community-level understandings of women's and girls' rights, by bridging the gaps between formal and informal systems, and by enabling more women to participate in both informal and formal systems. And we saw with the Regional Rights Resource Team in the Solomon Islands, who worked with traditional lay justices in rural areas, who had been given increased powers to authorise interim protection orders for women at risk of violence, they worked to connect them both to women in the community, but also into the new formal legal system around family protection. When dealing with customary practices that are deeply entrenched, such as, for example, child marriage in some areas, civil society organisations note that a bottom-up approach around mindsets is essential for long-term change, as the quote on the slide shows. Next slide, please. Our fourth finding was that improving access to justice for VAWG survivors and mechanisms for holding perpetrators accountable is incredibly important. Women and girls face both individual and structural barriers to accessing justice, and this creates a risk of further violence. Systems-level violence against women and girls prevention seeks to address the patterns that result in continual cycles of violence in the lives of women and within wider societies. So some civil society organisations were playing very important roles here. First, in supporting individual survivors to access justice and overcome the many barriers that were often in their way. But secondly, by strengthening systems that hold perpetrators accountable, especially in transitional justice or conflict-affected settings, where the state may be weak or where impunity may have become very common. This emphasis on the cycle of violence also raised questions for civil society organisations around how they understand justice. While some projects initially saw prevention and response as separate strategies, as the quote on the slide shows, their experience in delivering the programmes often showed that a comprehensive approach to justice includes all of these components to ensure that we think about justice as also being preventative, not just something that happens after violence has occurred. Next slide, please. Finally, reforming and implementing laws and policies during the COVID-19 pandemic created many new challenges in relation to preventing fraud. New legal and policy restrictions were often imposed as a result of the pandemic. Overloaded legal and government systems had different priorities, and the shifting of resources from VAWG prevention to other areas within these systems all played a role in creating what has been termed the shadow pandemic of violence against women and girls. Despite these challenges, civil society organisations were seen to be working to first strengthen their own systems to adjust to COVID-19 realities, and by doing so to build resilience for other disasters and emergencies. But secondly, to help ensure that new laws and policies that were coming in take into account VAWG prevention and integrate it into the wider national COVID-19 responses and plans. In this way, what was a systems level crisis also offered some positive possibilities for some organisations, many of whom operate in continued situations of emergency and crisis. For some organisations, the funds that were allocated for COVID-19 enabled them to strengthen their long-term resilience, as the quote from Leonard Cheshire in Zimbabwe on the slide notes. So that's a little whistle-stop tour through the 6 main findings, and I'm just going to move briefly now to key recommendations. So the report discusses a series of recommendations for practitioners, policymakers and donors, and researchers. And I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of these, and obviously you can read more about them in the brief itself. So recommendations for practitioners include thinking carefully about how they position themselves in relation to these wider legal and policy systems in their specific context, in ways that try to align with what is already going on in those systems. Second, the need to avoid politicization, even when working on political tasks like gender-based violence. To be political but not politicized was a very difficult line to tread. Third, capacitating formal government and legal duty bearers strengthens the system in a sustainable way that then reaches more women over time, even if it may be initially frustrating and slow to achieve. 4, bridging those gaps identified between formal and informal systems and actors around laws and policies, and working to make both of those systems more survivor-centered and interconnected. 5, working to disrupt those cycles of violence against women and girls longer term. And this requires integrating access to justice with prevention, enabling organizations to notice intergenerational patterns and to focus on perpetrator accountability. And finally, the value of civil society organizations becoming a resource for those wider legal and political systems in times of crisis. When COVID hit, those with pre-existing established relationships of trust with those larger systems could leverage this influence in important ways. Next slide, please. 3 main recommendations for donors and policymakers emerged. First, providing long-term and flexible funding for law and policy reform and implementation. This takes time, it requires trusting relationships, and is frequently affected by external factors. So that long-term commitment is really important, particularly for this area. Second, supporting civil society organizations to navigate complex power relations sensitively with formal and informal government and legal system stakeholders. Again, this can often be a highly politicized context, so being sensitive to that. And finally, developing creative and flexible ways to measure systems level impact in meaningful ways, which often requires a different kind of strategy to measuring individuals. Next slide, please. Finally, we made some recommendations for researchers in the VAWG field. The importance of taking an intersectional approach to researching law and policy reform and implementation. This needs to avoid reinforcing silos and look for system level synergies and interdependencies. Second, collaborating as researchers to build sector-wise and multi-sectoral patterns of evidence. And this includes supporting sector-wide learnings amongst civil society organizations and better understanding the civic society space within which all of them are functioning. Third, the opportunity that researchers have to document longer-term patterns of legal and policy systems change to begin to build that evidence base for the future. Fourth, using creative and participatory action research methodologies. These help us to acknowledge the inherent messiness of the political context of this work and the dilemmas that this can create for civil society organizations. And finally, it's important that CSOs and researchers in particular consider the specific policy-making audiences and to generate tailored research outputs that can be accessible and relevant for these audiences and their specific contexts. So I'm aware that I've rushed you through a lot. That's my brief overview. Please allow me to again say how much I valued the opportunity to do this piece of research that really centralized those who are working at this complex systems level to seek to change the wider environment for the long term, within which new generations of women and girls will experience life and to learn from them. Thank you.